The Law 300 of Mother Earth and Integral Development was approved in 2012. It is a very much important law in the context of a process of building an agenda of development which is very much different from a conventional and traditional agenda. That implies to see the development as an integral and holistic process, looking to tie this process to a harmony with nature, with Mother Earth. That includes, of course, to use concrete tools and methodologies in the process of planning the integral development that should have as targets or goals precisely the respect to rights of Mother Earth. So the complementarity of rights of Mother Earth with rights of development and rights of poor people related to the necessity of improving their social and economical conditions constitute part of the scope of the law of integral development and Mother Earth. We could say that the law of Mother Earth and integral development has four parts. The first one is related to concepts and principles, the philosophy, we would say, of the law. The second part is related to the goals of living well through the integral development, as it is literally called in the law. The third part is related to instruments and methodologies to be used in the process of management of ecosystems, of natural resources, and in the process of implementation of those goals of living well through integral development that I mentioned as part of the second part of the law. The fourth part of the law is related to climate change. And this is very much important because till the moment the law was approved, Bolivia didn't have a legal framework to manage and to have an intervention, an integral intervention in issues related to mitigation and adaptation in climate change, and to manage this big challenge, which is precisely to be prepared to the climate change and to manage to have concrete actions in terms of responding to the impacts of climate change. In the first part of the law, we can find important concepts and principles. Let's mention some of them. For example, the concept of regeneration and restoration of zones of life. Zones of life is called in the law regarding the ecosystems, and systems of life is another concept regarding the ecosystems in interaction with social actors and other stakeholders related to the use of natural resources in these zones of life or ecosystems. This is a very important concept. So regeneration, I would like to underscore this, is very much important because in the third part of the law, when we see the instruments and methodologies for managing the ecosystems, regeneration is very much important, and there is a mandate of the law for defining the limits of regeneration in the ecosystems. So that implies that those methodologies and instruments have to support a process of building agreements between different stakeholders and actors in the process of productions. Let's mention industry, let's mention agriculture, another process of production, so that those processes in a complementary way should respect the limits of regenerations of those ecosystems. In addition, the concept of functions of ecosystems, the environmental functions of ecosystems, is very much important. because this also implies in the third part of the law, where the instruments are described and for managing ecosystems and natural resources, the process of a strengthening of functions of ecosystems implies obligations for those actors that live and produce in the ecosystems, or obligations related to fostering the environmental functions. Let's mention some functions. For example, the provision of water, the purification of water and air. When we refer to forests, for example, the capture of carbon dioxide, etc., are part of these environmental functions. The law mentioned at least 9 environmental functions. So these concepts and principles that seems to be a little bit theoretical are very much important when we go to the third part of the law and we see and analyze concrete instruments in order to apply those concepts and principles. Regeneration is one, restoration is another. And these two concepts, regeneration and restoration, are part also of the outcome of Rio Plus 20 Conference of Sustainable Development, which took place in Brazil in 2012. So these elements are very much connected, linked to the discussion in the international arena about how to build a different kind of vision of development and to improve these visions and approach, which are traditional and which are mainly related to economical and financial issues and trade issues, etc. Development has to be seen and has to be built in a different way. The second part of the law provides 10 goals for living well through integral development. Let me underscore this. We're not talking about goals of development, we're talking about goals of living well through integral development. Development is therefore a mean, not a goal. And these 10 goals includes, for example, change of patterns of consumption, achieve sustainable patterns of consumption and production, food security and food sovereignty. Let's mention, for example, fostering environmental functions and fostering institutions related to protected areas, natural protected areas, goals related to education, to health, etc. So these 10 goals of living well are very detailed, described in the law in terms of targets, at least general targets that are part of each one of these goals. And it is also important to mention that there is a link, a very strong link, connection between these goals and the agenda of integral development that Bolivia approved, which has a horizon which is 2025. The year 2025 is a very famous agenda in Bolivia, the patriotic agenda, which is also a concrete instrument that comes from the law of Mother Earth. So the law of Mother Earth has been developed by other instruments of planning related to integral and holistic development. The final part of the law, the fourth part, is related to climate change. And it creates a new authority, the authority of Mother Earth, which is the institution called to manage process of planning, of implementing policies and instruments of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. It creates 3 mechanisms: the mechanism of adaptation, the mechanism of mitigation, the mechanism of joint mitigation adaptation in the context of forest management, integral forest management. This last mechanism has also been introduced, I would say, in the former or legal decisions of United Nations framework of climate change since COP17 in 2011, so that this instrument, this tool, is not only part of the national legislation of Bolivia, but it is also part of the international decisions of United Nations related to climate change. And the particularity of this mechanism is that constitutes an alternative tool to REDD+, which is the traditional tool used in the context of climate change and which mainly stresses the role of forests related to carbon capture, where the issues of adaptation, let's mention agriculture and water, are co-benefits but are not part of the central scope of this instrument called REDD+. On the other side, this alternative instrument, which is the Joint Mitigation Adaptation Mechanism for the Integral Management of Forests, has a very broader scope, and it includes indicators of adaptation and mitigation. So that these three mechanisms are part of the law and are managed by the authority of Mother Earth. And a fourth tool that is managed by this authority is the Plurinational Fund of Mother Earth, so that the law creates a fund which is going to receive financial resources. For the beginning, the President, through the law, has decided to put a seed, an initial contribution in terms of financial resources, and it is expected to have additional contributions coming from the international arena. Let's mention the Green Climate Fund, only to mention one, another possible bilateral funds related to the climate change universe of institutions and entities, and of course of public and even private funds coming from the national level and could be even from the international level. So that this system has been designed in the law in order to address the issue of climate change at the national level, support the process of planning at the subnational institutions, let's mention the regions, let's mention the municipalities, and foster the process of the capacities of planning and the implementation of plans at the subnational level, and even to work directly with communities and social organizations who are going to implement on the ground this mechanism. This mechanism has begun to be implemented at the local level, and there is a process of building agreements between among different kind of stakeholders related, for example, to forest. It is important to mention that the Joint Mitigation Adaptation Mechanism for Integral Management of Forest and Mother Earth is not only related to forest, but to agriculture, to other kind of ecosystems where forest could be recreated through process of forestation, reforestation, and afforestation. So the concept of forest is also a very general concept that includes the management of ecosystem, not only the traditional concepts related to the mass of the biomass or the biodiversity mass called forests. The idea is also to use this mechanism in order to promote integral development, integral management in the ecosystem, so that these mechanisms should be useful, for example, to address issues in adaptation, let's say in adaptation, with a focus on adaptation, issues related to gender, for example, fostering gender, fostering activities of women organization, mainly the poor ones, are part of the scope and the approach of this mechanism. That is why this mechanism is holistic. And this is precisely the difference with the other mechanism in United Nations climate change decision, which is REDD+. The law of Mother Earth has introduced a very, I would say, strong argument, or arguments in plural, in order to rethink the approaches of development that we traditionally had or inherited from the past decades and the traditional or conventional visions of development, and is precisely creating now a very complex and dynamic discussion internally in the process of planning of development. It is in certain way creating contradictions internally in the discussion about how to address development, for example, related to mining activities, mining productions, or oil production, or agro-industry production. The law, for example, introduces very I would say controversial mandates, like, for example, the gradual elimination of genetic modified organism in the agriculture. It says gradually, but it sends a clear mandate that this has to be eliminated. So that we have to discuss about how to link the right to safe, healthy food with the process of gradually eliminate the use of genetic modified organism. This has very strong implication in the agro-industry sector, and has to be part of the discussion in the next years when we are going to Bolivian governments at the national and the subnational level are going to define concrete projects and plans related to agriculture. How are we going to foster, for example, the ecological and organic agriculture is one of the challenges of this process from the perspective of the law. We have to have clarity about the fact that this law is a framework law. That implies that with the mandate of this law, the concrete and specific laws are going to be designed and approved. And let me mention some of them: the law of biodiversity, the law of environment, the law of protected areas, the law of water, which is in process of discussion. There is already a draft of this law, the law of forest, and other specific laws that are going to be defined under the umbrella, which is the framework law, the law of Mother Earth and integral development. And we hope that we are going to have a very strong and complex discussion when these processes of definition of these specific laws are going to be agreed. And of course, in certain moment, when the instruments for management of ecosystems are going to be approved, let me mention one of them, for example, the definition of limits of regeneration. When this is going to happen, this instrument have to be applied, for example, to the activities of mining production or oil production or other industrial activities inside the ecosystems. So let's think the process of applying the law as a process. Let me reiterate this. And we're still beginning this process, guided by the law. And the challenge is precisely to be guided by the law and to interpret it correctly. We have seen with a lot of concern the fact that in the agenda of negotiation of United Nations on climate change issues has been pointing as a central element the issue of carbon markets and business. These issues, business related to climate change, business related to technologies, to investments, to credits, to insurance, business related to carbon prices, carbon markets, etc., suddenly seems to be part of the central agenda of climate change discussion. And this is something that leads us to a different context of building solutions to climate change and distract our attention. We feel that this kind of discussion is concentrating the attention on means on which we have a lot of doubts, we would say, concentrating the attention on means more than on ends. And markets and business is not or are not the end of the challenge of looking for solutions for climate change. But suddenly seems to be part of the main concerns of particularly developed countries. We do not see we do not believe that markets, carbon markets, or business are going to bring solutions to the process of mitigation and adaptation. And if there is a trend to promote business and markets as part of the solution of climate change problems or impacts, we would say that we are in the wrong pathway. If we feel or think that carbon markets are going to be the appropriate incentives to promote mitigation actions, we would say, just with a simple sight to what is happening in the markets, that this is not going to happen. The financial crisis has hit severely the carbon markets. Carbon prices were $40 more or less per ton in 2007, 2006, and after the financial crisis, the ton of carbon was 60 cents of dollars. So this is not a predictable source for financing adaptation and mitigation actions. It's not a sustainable source for financing mitigation and adaptation actions. It's not correct and I would say effective incentive to promoting mitigation actions. We are in the wrong pathway if we believe that markets are going to be the most adequate incentives for a process of mitigation. We need public commitments. We need public contributions. We need the governments to make commitments, political commitments, legal commitments in the context of a new legal instruments, and to use the most appropriate methodologies and tools in order to promote and to implement mitigation actions. Those tools have to be defined in the national context and have to be also to be proposed from the international arena. Let's mention the discussions and the negotiation on United Nations framework on climate change. That is part of the critiques and observations we have presented regarding the issue of carbon markets. We are very concerned about REDD+, for example, which is in process of being linked to carbon markets. Not only because of carbon markets, but also because of the approach of REDD+, which emphasizes the role of forests mainly in terms of carbon capture, and see the other possible actions related to adaptation as co-benefits, but not as central elements of an approach of this methodology. That is why Bolivia has proposed the joint mitigation adaptation for the integral management of forests, which includes, of course, concrete outputs related to mitigation, that is carbon capture, which could be measured, which could be reported, which could be verified and even monitored. But in addition, it is important to strengthen the conditions, the social conditions of populations that live in and from the forests. That is why we believe that the tools related to mitigation and adaptation in an integral way should contribute to sustainable development and poverty eradication, and not only to be seen as tools for mitigation. This is very much important. That is why Bolivia has presented a lot of proposals, like the one I mentioned. Recently, we have presented a new proposal of a new mechanism, which is the climate resilience and sustainable development of mechanism, which has been recently presented. And we have also led the process of negotiation and construction of the proposal of the international mechanism on loss and damage. It is important to underscore the fact that the world is nowadays still facing conditions of poverty and hunger. These conditions are part of the reality of developing countries and are part of the agenda of development of these developing countries. so that we do not have to lose attention to the fact that the decisions regarding mitigation and adaptation has to also contribute to poverty eradication and sustainable development. That is why the equitable access to sustainable development, which is part of one of the decisions of climate change we took in the last COPs, and the equitable distribution of the carbon budgets have to be part of the discussion. And when we are talking about carbon budget, we are talking about the amount of carbon which we can emit in the next years, having certainty that these emissions have to decline as soon as possible on the basis of the science suggestions and science prescriptions. Let's see for that the last report of the international the panel of climate change, the international panel of experts of climate change report, which suggests to have a very drastic reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases in the short term. But besides that, it is a fact that we have to distribute within all the countries of the world these budgets of carbon that the planet could support, in order not to increase the temperature more than 2 degrees in the next years. And this implies an agreement with commitments coming from parties, with contributions in terms of saying what are we going to do in terms of actions, and even quantified commitments for reduction and limitation of emissions of greenhouse gases. And we expect that developed countries are going to take the lead, and also, of course, expect that emerging countries and those countries who have the capabilities, the technological ones mainly, have to also contribute leading this process. Of course, in the context of common but differentiated responsibilities. And we expect also that all the other countries, even my country, our country, are going to contribute to mitigation, but considering that we also have to have a very flexible space and time frame for guaranteeing the sustainable development and the transition, the gradual transition to a very low carbon economy. When we say gradual, we have to mention that we expect to have in this process the transfers of technology, the development of capacities, and the financial resources required to do so.